Major breaking news right now. The U.S. Justice Department has just named a special counsel.
CNN has learned new information about that ongoing investigation into those allegations raised in a collection of memos.
That the committee direct the chairman to issue a subpoena from Donald John Trump in connection with the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol.
Faithful adherence to the rule of law is the bedrock principle of the Justice Department and of our democracy.
I think this is a persecution of a political opponent.
What happened?
Americans are rightly questioning what has happened to our country, especially in Washington, D.C. over the last 8 years. How was the duly elected president of the United States targeted by the Department of Justice and the FBI? How did the FBI and Justice Department knowingly use a fabricated dossier to lie to a federal court to secure 4 warrants in an abuse of federal power? How can President Trump have his home thuggishly raided on the thinnest of pretenses, the handling of classified documents, while Joe Biden got a free pass on the mishandling of the same types of classified documents? How is it possible that President Trump spent 4 years in an internal struggle during his first administration fighting federal departments and agencies to get them to follow federal laws and the will of the American people? And why was no one at the FBI, the DOJ, the courts, any federal agency or department ever held accountable or suffered consequences for these illegal acts? It was the great outsider of Trump who brought this administrative state into the light and to the surface. And now the American people have the opportunity to take their government back.
And then there's the election interference. And this is the one that came with an Easter egg in the middle of it that I still can't quite believe they just confirmed.
President, when you say he's a con man, do you think that he knows what he's doing, that he's lying?
It looks like collusion. I mean, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck.
These career bureaucrats at DOJ, these career agents at the FBI, all of whom were left-leaning, who believed that their opinions on government and how this country should be governed trumped the will of the American people, decided that they were going to take this threat out. And so what did they do? They started an investigation, a federal investigation, based on a made-up political dossier from who? Oh, the Hillary Clinton campaign, the Democrats. We've created an enormous administrative state of elitist, arrogant bureaucrats who are unelected and unaccountable and are the absolute antithesis of what our founders envisioned.
My amendment would apply a 14% reduction across the board to the non-defense activities included in this division. Without it,
I will fully admit to you, I was elected the same election day as Donald Trump, so I was a brand new freshman congressman coming to Washington. And we all got swept up in it. It completely derailed our ability to advance the agenda that Donald Trump was elected to fulfill. And that's what it was about. It was a tactic, not just by the left, but by big media, by the administrative state, by the bureaucrats in Washington, the swamp. It was a tactic to block Donald Trump from doing what he was elected to do. That flat out, that's what it was about.
And I think that's one of Donald Trump's greatest sins in the eyes of permanent DC. That the great outsider showed up and thought, I'm the one duly elected president of the United States who decides a lot of domestic and foreign policy. And permanent DC, with its allies and the corporate propagandists and establishment DC, and even, quite frankly, some inside the Republican Party, if we're being honest, do you think it comes down to the fundamental issue of who decides?
Yeah, I think that the 3 most dangerous words in Donald Trump's vocabulary that he spoke in the election of 2016, that the establishment, the elites, the ruling class in the country heard was drain the swamp.
It's time to drain the swamp in Washington, D.C.
President Trump is absolutely right. We need to deal with the debt ceiling. We need to get it off the table so that he can proceed to do what he needs to do without Chuck Schumer rattling the markets with threats of default.
The animus toward President Trump wasn't a classic, I'll call it the Reagan, left side, socialist, communist against, free market, free enterprise, capitalism, cowboy. It wasn't that. This was deep state, uniparty, swamp, the defense industrial complex, all of that, whatever terms you want to use. And some of these are terms that people just throw around. What I mean are all of the decision makers around here, because it's all of this largesse around Washington, D.C. And it is largesse that is built around people whose entire world is built around power that they control and they decide.
The practices, the politics, and the culture of Washington, D.C. are all antithetical to a healthy, functioning American republic. That's just the reality. This city that is named after perhaps the greatest American ever, George Washington himself, this city does not in any sense function any longer as the agency and protector of the American people. Instead, it is the abuser of the American people.
I think the most alarming thing that we saw was the organized stream of communication between the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the largest tech companies in the country. This is quite serious. We didn't know whether it was against the law, but we certainly thought it was shocking.
There were so many FBI people at Twitter that they had their own internal group and their own little crib sheet to describe the difference between the terms that they use at the FBI versus at Twitter. Yeah, CIA as well had their own little internal group.
The government outsources its censorship and other unconstitutional bad deeds to these big corporations. And our founders understood that concentrated power, whether it was in government or in businesses, is very dangerous to our economy, and it's very dangerous to our liberties. And we're seeing this particularly with big tech. You have these trillion-dollar big tech monopolists, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. They take these huge grants from the federal government. They get Section 230 immunity from the federal government, and up until very recently, starting under President Trump, they had antitrust amnesty from the federal government. So when the federal government, like the Tony Fauci's of the world, would call over to Facebook, for example, and say, you need to censor these Americans who are questioning me on my COVID nonsense, like the 6-foot rule or the mask mandate that he just pulled out of thin air and made America miserable for several years, Facebook would say, okay, Tony Fauci, how high do you want us to jump, right? When you have your hands around the neck of one corporation because they have all that corporate power, it's very easy to make them do the government's bidding that they otherwise would not be able to get away with.
I think my biggest lesson, 8 years, 4 years of Trump, 4 years of Biden, is it's all about the money.
Yeah.
And what does Congress do? It appropriates the money, it spends the money. So the continuing resolutions, the omnibus bills, Congress is the branch of government that provides oversight, and we do a little bit of that around here. But at the end of the day, oversight is spending, is giving these agencies money to pay for themselves.
Right.
And my biggest disappointment in Washington isn't with Democrats. It's with Republicans that go along with it every single time and vote to pass these spending bills that rewards these agencies who completely thumb their nose at our oversight.
DOGE is something that many of us have wanted to do for years, fighting waste, fraud, and abuse. We have always been fought by the bureaucracy, and isn't it amazing that you've got these bureaucrats who feel like they have civil service protection, that you cannot fire them. So when you contact the agency for an answer, they will slow walk it. They refuse to answer. They do not want to give you the necessary information, and many times it's because they feel like they can wait you out.
I never thought I would say it. I'm in favor and was and supported and I'm a friend of Bobby Kennedy.
Yeah.
Because he wants to break the back of the status quo in this town.
He rejects the premise.
As does Tulsi, as does Pete,
As does Pete,
as does
Cash.
as does Cash, and that's why the swamp hates President Trump.
Right.
And it's frankly why I've been so energized over the last month with the picks that he's making.
Yeah.
I don't agree with all of them. There's one or two that have been, but almost all of them are people who want to disrupt that. And I'm telling you, this town is now as nervous as it's ever been.
He has turned over our country to Elon Musk. We didn't elect him. We didn't select him. We didn't ask for him. And we don't want him.
Alex, this is part of what is an illegal rampage by Elon Musk across these federal agencies.
Before our very eyes, an unelected shadow government is conducting a hostile takeover of the federal government.
Who is really running the U.S. government? For tens of millions of Americans, the past 8 years, the targeting of President Donald J. Trump confirmed that there are two competing forms of government operating in Washington, D.C. The government mirage that Americans think is working for them, and the career bureaucrats and their allies on Capitol Hill, the courts, and the media who operate the government in the shadows.
We must recognize that there are two competing forms of government in this country that have been in existence for over 100 years. On one hand, an administrative state, a massive bureaucracy filled with unelected bureaucrats who do the real governing that has nothing to do with representative government. On the other, a constitutional republic with its separation and diffusion of powers, in which all power is to flow from the people to their duly elected representatives, who they make the stewards of the power and money given to them to actually implement the will of the people on all things both foreign and domestic. The reason that this conflict has simmered beneath the surface between these two different forms of government is that too many have accepted the premise that the administrative state is actually legitimate. That is, until Donald J. Trump showed up in Washington, D.C.
At the heart of the differences between a constitutional republic and an administrative state are polar opposite beliefs about human nature. The founders of the free American Republic were optimistic realists, deeply realistic about human nature with its multitude of flaws and shortcomings, yet optimistic that they could, working with imperfect human nature, create a government that protected all of our God-given rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Faced with the challenges of creating a government strong and responsive enough to advance and protect those rights from foreign and domestic threats, including itself, the founders infused the nascent republic with transcendent values that have stood the test of time.
Look at our revolutionary founding as Americans. We escaped the British crown. And in Britain, you have God who gives power to a sovereign king or queen, and then that power, those rights are lent to their subjects through documents like the Magna Carta. But the king or the queen is always the sovereign. They're the ones who always control everything. They have the power. In America, it is a radically different concept. The power goes from God to we the people, the sovereign citizens, and then we loan power to our governments through the U.S. Constitution, a loan agreement. It's a radically different concept. We don't have a First Amendment right to free speech because of the First Amendment. We have a God-given right to free speech. We have a God-given right to associate. We have a God-given right to worship. We have a God-given right to protect ourselves, not because the First and Second Amendments. It's because we didn't give away those rights in our loan agreement called the U.S. Constitution.
Some of our founders, like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, didn't actually believe that a Bill of Rights was the greatest protector of our national inherent rights. They believed in the machinery of the Republic. Describe to me the machinery of the Republic in regards to this diffusion of power and the separation of powers as it being the greatest protector and secure of our natural rights.
If you have a system where power is spread out laterally and then up and down between localities, states, the federal government, in which the contract itself is written in such a way that it says that the government only has certain powers and everything else is assumed to be a retained right or power of the states, then through that, you basically ensure that all of these different factions will have enough buy-in through elections to prevent mass abuse of rights. That breaks down when you start to trample on that very system. The system that is supposed to protect us no longer exists, and it hasn't existed for a long time because the federal government sees itself as a higher power than states and localities. And they've been removing power from Congress and into the hands of people who are not actually elected.
Progressives were utopian statists, deeply naive, willfully so, about human nature and the dangers of consolidated power. They mistakenly sought utopia in a fallen world. All of this nonsense led to progressive statists working on concentrating tremendous power in the hands of a relative few. In defiance of the ages, progressives thought human nature was not inherently evil, but was perfectible and could rise to a higher plane in the here and now. Underlying the history of American government for most of the 20th century is a dynamic that is little discussed: the slow transfer of legitimate governance of this nation from the duly elected members of Congress to the unelected bureaucrats of the administrative state. The founders believed deeply in the machinery of the republic and the diffusion of power between the separate branches of government. They didn't want to create a government that benefited them exclusively as the future leaders of the country. In reality, the separation of powers limited them and their ability to use the new government for their benefit because, unlike the progressive statists, they did not trust themselves. In a massive administrative state, there arises the age-old question posited by the ancient Roman poet Juvenal, who asked, "Who guards the guards?" Or, as Francis Schaeffer asked, "Who controls the controllers?" In the founders' thinking, the political process of elections allowed those running the government to be held in check, ergo regular elections, but not with progressive statists. They believed politics was the corrupting force, not human nature. They have done everything they can over the course of the last 100 years to remove oversight and accountability for those who are truly doing the governing. Because what could possibly go wrong with incredible power in the hands of a relatively few imperfect human beings? Is a dangerous naivete that's existed over the course of most of human history, from Plato and his guardians until today.
It was the rise of professional politics, I think, in some sense, that precipitated this slide into the self-licking ice cream cone that has become the government, right? The government basically exists to serve itself. The Congress exists to get reelected. The government, elects these Congress to sustain itself. It doesn't serve the people anymore. When the founders envisioned the branches, each branch was supposed to jealously guard its own authority, but they never envisioned the administrative state, right? So it's become this sort of pariah branch of the executive that's the most jealous of all the branches, and this one's not even supposed to be there, and none of the other branches can effectively battle it back. So it's just become this centerpiece, this black hole sucking in all the light from the federal government.
The founders envisioned the Article I branch, the legislative branch, doing the legislating. Do you agree with the premise that what has taken place is very much an unconstitutional subdelegating of legislative authority to the Article II branch, where most of the administrative state resides in these bureaucrats? Would you say that's really how DC works in more ways than people want to admit?
Yeah, sadly, yes. And everybody around here on Capitol Hill will complain. Everybody, meaning members of Congress and the Senate, will complain about it. Okay. The executive branch, they're making these rules that we go home and complain about to our constituents that it's the executive branch. But for too many of my colleagues, Republican and Democrat, it's too easy to allow them to do that. It lets you off the hook. Now the question though, Ned, is how can you complain about that and then turn around and vote for a spending bill that funds these same bureaucrats and these agencies that are creating these problems? Every time we have one of these CRs or an omnibus bill, every time I get optimistic and then let down by Republicans when I see 100 Republicans in the House vote for it because they're afraid of a government shutdown. So they give in. We got to vote for it, fund the government. We'll fight that fight the next time, and they never do.
Unelected, educated elites armed with immense power were to fill the envisioned administrative state, separated as much as possible from politics, elected officials, and the accountability the people's representatives bring. The walls dividing the branches of government were to be knocked down. power consolidated in the hands of the educated elite to advance progress as efficiently as possible.
Let's go back all the way to sort of the beginning of Wilsonian progressivism and say their intent was actually, benevolent rule by the experts, not for anything more than that. The natural conclusion and the logical and rational conclusion is exactly what we're seeing today, which is tyranny of the expert, and the expert elevating himself above the foundational ideals of rule by the people. Because at the end of the day, when you get this many experts in one place and you give them the authority that they have, they don't want to be ruled by the rabble. They don't want to be constrained by the rabble. They don't want to be told anything outside of their sort of philosophical ivory tower, pointy head, self-credentialing conference. And the people become the enemy.
The only separation of powers, though, that the progressives do approve of is separating themselves from political accountability, which of course means that they then become a parallel government. I mean, an agency cannot be accountable only to itself.
Well, here's the problem with the whole concept of the administrative state. It requires benevolent dictators, and we don't have benevolent dictators. We have humans, and they have their flaws as humans. Some of them are corrupt, some of them are selfish, some of them have ulterior motives than what one would call the public good. And so until we have perfect humans, we're not going to be able to have an administrative state.
The Leviathan grows ever stronger, ever larger, ever more powerful. Elections come and go, but that administrative state, the permanent political class, remains. And in fact, not just remains, but gets all the more pernicious and potent, unfortunately.
When you destroy the separation of powers, you hollow out the Constitution, and you destroy the mechanism of the Republic.
Progressives hated the machinery of the Republic because it was seen as an extremely inefficient system that got in their way of actually administering totality of power into one hand. And the protection of individual natural rights is an extreme impediment to their ability to move in that direction. They view our system as a huge hurdle to their ultimate objective, because our system was, of course, it came right out of an environment where we were distrustful of an abusive government, but our founders recognized that you do need some government. People are not perfect. We do have problems, we have vices. If we're able to do things, often many of us will, whether or not you should. And so you need certain inherent governmental barriers to protect a nation. But the question was, how do we make it so diffused and spread out so that none of it's concentrated in one hand? And what the left has been doing for the last century plus is methodically undoing that. They've been concentrating power through the federal government, up from cities and states, and then within the federal government into unelected bureaucrats. And ultimately their goal is to have one person making ultimately every single decision for all of us, and that's the direction they're moving in.
The roots of this quagmire extend back to the turn of the 20th century, when progressives really grabbed onto this philosophy of statism. A centralized, top-down statism directed and shaped by a supposedly enlightened managerial class, who would use their credentials to allegedly manage the affairs of the unwashed masses, the regular citizens who cannot be trusted to make their own decisions. Who are they? Who are these fellow travelers who paved the way for the leftist status of today? Well, I refer to them as the four horsemen of the progressive apocalypse: Woodrow Wilson, Robert La Follette, Herbert Croly, and Theodore Roosevelt. One of the leading intellectuals of the progressive movement, Woodrow Wilson is today primarily known as a two-term president, but he actually began his career inside of academia, of course. You might think universities are intellectually polluted now, and they are, to be sure. But that decay extends back many decades, including to Wilson's tenure as president of Princeton before he began his political career. From Princeton, he became governor of New Jersey and served one term before his successful campaign for the White House, winning in 1912. Wilson was lauded in his day, but history has increasingly realized the truth of this malevolent man, a racist and a bigot to the core, an authoritarian at every opportunity in politics. But well before his presidency, Wilson revealed his dark philosophy in writings and speeches in the 1880s and the 1890s. He began fleshing out the political goals and governing approach of the progressive statist movement in America.
In his study of administration, Wilson would write that his idea of agencies and bureaucracies filled with educated elites and a managerial class is a foreign science. It has been developed by French and German professors. He would continue to write, bureaucracy can exist only where the whole service of the state is removed from the common political life of the people, its chiefs as well as its rank and file. Its motives, its objects, its policy, its standards must be bureaucratic. As Wilson, a lifelong Democrat, agitated for progressive reform on the East Coast, the movement also began rising in the Midwest. Fighting Bob La Follette, a lifelong Republican, became disillusioned with the Republican Party in Wisconsin in the 1890s. In 1900, on his fourth try, La Follette became governor of Wisconsin. Progressives lauded La Follette and his reforms, describing Wisconsin as a scientific laboratory of reform. Wisconsin is the most efficient commonwealth in the United States, a model for America just as Germany was for the world. Germany was the world's most advanced scientific state because it was the first to call in the experts, but Wisconsin was not far behind. And the best part about Germany, according to education reformer John Dewey, was that Germany subordinated its legislature to the bureaucracy, which conducted the real business of government, administration. The least known of the four horsemen of the progressive apocalypse was Herbert Croly, who in 1909 shot to fame in the progressive statist movement with the publishing of his first book, The Promise of American Life. Croly's vision was a concentration of power into the hands of a few to resolve any conflicts in society, the chief source of which he saw as private property. To remove the cause of conflict, he argued that the removal of property, the nationalization of corporations, and then the redistribution of it all would in fact make the country more democratic. The fourth and final horseman of the progressive apocalypse was Theodore Roosevelt. After leaving the White House in 1909, pledging that he would never again run for the White House, Roosevelt became a full-throated champion of progressive statism. In August of 1910, he delivered his new nationalism speech in Osawatomie, Kansas. In his speech, Roosevelt dismissed the founders' ideas on property rights and the notion that one has a natural inherent right to the fruits of his labor, arguing instead that any right to property depended on whether the community felt it benefited the whole. The man who wrongly holds that every human right is secondary to his profit must now give way to the advocate of human welfare, who rightly maintains that every man holds his property subject to the general welfare of the community to regulate its use to whatever degree the public welfare may require it. We should permit property to be gained only so long as the gaining represents benefit to the community, said Roosevelt. While Roosevelt and his Progressive Party were denied the White House in 1912, they did receive a consolation prize. Many of their stated goals were achieved when President Woodrow Wilson began immediately implementing progressive statist ideas, helping to enact the income tax via the Revenue Act of 1913, and signing into law the Federal Reserve Act and then the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914. These statists in the U.S. borrowed heavily from Georg Hegel, who believed in a managerial elite who would supposedly run governments using so-called scientific methods without the bothersome details like obtaining the consent of the governed or even considering the wisdom of the citizens of our country. Born in 1770, Hegel believed that there was no transcendent truth, that all truth is relative to that moment in history, and that the whole story of history is a continual march from the irrational to the rational, a march towards progress. As a paid propagandist of the Prussian monarch, Hegel aimed at promoting and advancing authoritarian philosophy in which the state was all. In fact, Hegel wrote that the state decides what is freedom of thought. The state decides what is truth. The state gives rights. The state can take away rights. Building off the deeply rooted Hegelian idea that the state is the march of God on earth, that history is a linear progression from the irrational to rational, the aim of politics then becomes, of course, all about progress and salvation via the state. As Ronald Pistrito writes in America Transformed, cooperation with history thus becomes a kind of divine imperative and a test of one's faithfulness to God. Those refusing to go along with the demands of historical progress are therefore defying the will of God himself.
The Civil War, obviously, was a greatly disruptive force on American society, and people, in the post-Civil War period are looking for new answers. But unfortunately, these answers come out of various philosophic traditions that are quite hostile to the Founders' Constitution and the Founders' theory of human nature.
The 16th Amendment, of course, was the beginning of the IRS and the progressive income tax. That served two purposes. Robert La Follette believed that the income tax would help with the redistribution of wealth to achieve social justice, and also the funding of the new Leviathan of the administrative state. If there was to be a new, massive, sprawling bureaucracy, tariffs alone were not going to fund it.
The growth of the administrative state is inexorably tied, it's not just correlated, with the rise in the income tax and the rise with the fact that any form of taxation can be created. With their interpretation of the Commerce Clause, which they blew the doors off of starting in the 1930s with the New Deal, with that interpretation, they can tax anything. That power to create taxes has resulted in an explosion of government, an explosion of regulation. They're inexorably tied to each other.
So it's no coincidence that the growth of the administrative state and the progressive movement in the United States came on the heels of social Darwinism and this idea that society could evolve to a perfect state and that it was perpetually getting better. And this came on the heels of the Enlightenment, which was this whole idea that human nature is perfectible, that humans through science and reason can reach this perfect state. And so enter the administrative state, it's seen by progressives as this tool of salvation, this tool that you can use to make society perfect, not just better, but perfect. And so when that's your view of the state, why would you want to limit it? If the bigger the state is, the more it can help people. If that's your mindset, why would you want checks on federal power?
The progressives understood that the administrative state had to be fed. That beast had to be fed, and it gets fed by our taxes. They understood that the founders' vision of a limited federal government that survived on excise taxes, which are prescribed in the Constitution. There was a time when we only survived on excise taxes. And they understood that that would keep the federal government small and hopefully efficient. Instead, the progressives look at it and say, no, this is a religious quest for progressives. We must grow the administrative state because the administrative state must take over every aspect of American life, right? Your healthcare, your education. They must reach into the places where the founders had really, by culture, walled off and wanted to prevent the federal government from getting into that. They wanted your local communities and your states to be the prime beneficiaries of your tax dollars.
Early progressives, many of them, were actually in their own minds serious Christians. But as the 20th century wears on, God drops out of the equation, and all you're left with is confidence in the administrative state, confidence in expertise, confidence in concentrated power, and God is forgotten and indeed rejected. So, but the moralistic fervor is still there. The moralistic fervor of the early progressives becomes fully secularized by the end of the 20th century.
We must recognize that this failed experiment launched a century ago by progressive statists like Woodrow Wilson is deeply unconstitutional in its approach to government. It's antithetical to a free, representative government founded by the American Republic. It is the polar opposite of what our founders envisioned, with unelected bureaucrats governing the country while wholly unresponsive to we the people. This albatross upon America, this stifling menace of an all-powerful and unaccountable state, it robs Americans of their God-given agency. It destroys widespread prosperity. It saps confidence. And it disgraces the wondrous inheritance handed down to us by our founders, and indeed to all of our ancestors who tamed a continent and built the greatest nation ever since ancient Rome.
In America, it has always been built on this idea that everybody can have different beliefs and everybody's opinion matters, right? But we are living in a scenario right now where the people with power, the power centers in this country, and I'm not talking about corporate power or, you know, different ties. I'm talking about concentrated government power, the ability to control how you live, think a very certain way. And they think they know more than the people that founded this country. They think they know more than the people who make up this country. And they think that their job is to impose their view on the rest of us. And they cloak it in such a way that this isn't just a difference of opinion, right? Because that would be American. They cloak it in a way that this is blasphemy, and this is treason, and this is all the things that are not allowed in America, and you should be jailed for disagreeing with this. And it's not only, they don't present their thoughts as opinions, right? They cloak them in things like, we saw with COVID, the science, or, well, the experts say, and then it literally becomes tantamount to founding religious philosophy or the pseudo-constitution of the United States the way they see it. And then again, you are not in a situation of, well, I just disagree and we have a difference of opinion. We now have, I'm in charge and you're going to jail.
Our democracy has become synonymous with an embrace of the administrative state. Anything the administrative state is doing, anything that the deep state is doing, is identified by the left with our democracy. In fact, it is the enemy of our constitutional republic.
I always try to remind people to start off that, when the Constitution was formed, there were 4 cabinet members, right? Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, and the Attorney General. I think those have been from memory. And now we've got this vast bureaucracy, right? And I think, notable as an example is the Department of Homeland Security, created in the wake of 9/11, 250,000 employees. We literally haven't authorized it since we created it. This is what happened. Yeah, right? Mind blowing. We created it. We've never reauthorized it.
The administrative state has taken over the role that Congress is supposed to occupy. Congress is supposed to determine how the money gets spent and how much of it. But what have they done? They threw up their hands and said, we're just going to allow government to grow. And every year, in every division that has any kind of budget authority in this federal government, they figure out ways to spend it all and then come back and say, well, we spent it all, we need more.
The regulatory Leviathan is incredibly dangerous, and really for 2 reasons. For one, you're exactly right. It crushes our rights, right? Our inherent God-given rights, the rights which are, of course, spelled out magnificently in the Bill of Rights. That's the first reason. But the second reason is it robs us of prosperity as a society. America is not nearly as productive as it should be, as it could be. We are not as successful. We don't have the broadness of prosperity in our country that we used to have in terms of an empowered and big and substantial middle class. Why? Because this consolidation of power, it's not just about political power, although that's crucial. The consolidation of power is also about the consolidation of economic power. And that's why we see such massive disparities. And by the way, here's one of the few places where I'll actually agree with some of the folks on the populist left, some of the Bernie bros. Look, income inequality, wealth inequality is a problem in this country. It absolutely is. And much of it is fueled by the administrative state. Because what's the easiest way now? What's the best way, the quickest way to get really successful in this country? It's to be connected to the administrative state as a private actor, ostensibly private sector actor, but one who is deeply embedded with the administrative state power brokers, particularly in Washington, D.C.
We have wrongly inserted the federal government into too many aspects of our lives. And so we've made choices that enabled the empowerment of those bureaucrats, whether it's healthcare, like I just described, and everything from the input side and what we're dealing with the FDA and food, what we eat, medicine, what medicines we're taking, mandates, vaccines, all of those debates, as well as then the constraints on our ability to go to the doctor of our choice through Obamacare and through the alphabet soup of all of the regulations that have been destroying healthcare for the better part of 4 or 5 generations while we empower administrators versus doctors. That's all one bucket. What about all of the bureaucrats at the Department of Justice who have been targeting Americans, targeting President Trump? The people like the FACE Act victims who are simply exercising their free speech rights and their religious rights, and they end up in jail through the federal government because the Department of Justice is very clearly targeting them because of their views. And there are thousands of examples like that where Americans are being harassed by the ATF, by the FBI, the J6 folks that were having their houses stormed because they were on the Capitol property. When you empower bureaucrats You're doing precisely what the founders feared. And then they start taking the power, and then suddenly you have no voice anymore. And that's what's really happening, though, in every aspect, in every agency around this town. Go point to an agency and tell me where that's not happening, right? Whether it's the United Nations, World Health Organization, where we're turning over our sovereignty. Again, Congress is funding all of these things. Congress is providing the fuel for the very bureaucrats that are taking away our liberties and targeting us, and then Congress goes out and campaigns against those things and then goes and funds it again. It's mind-blowing.
And this gets to the problem of the Leviathan of the administrative state being so all-powerful. Because it is so powerful, it's relatively easy for the administrative state and for the agents that benefit from it, most of whom are in Washington, D.C., it's relatively easy for them to coerce, intimidate, and co-opt the corporate media. So what do I mean by that? Well, the corporate media wants access more than anything else. So let me give you a very specific example. The intelligence community can say, we're going to feed you access. We're going to give you scoops occasionally, but you're also going to do our bidding. You're going to protect us, even when we are infringing upon the clear delineated rights of the American people. So let me be even more specific here. When it comes to big tech, although they are ostensibly private companies, they work in cahoots and in coordination with big media, as well as the administrative state in Washington, D.C. This isn't some theory. I mean, we know this. We know for a fact, for example, that the Biden administration was directly through back channels pressuring big tech companies to not allow, quote, misinformation regarding things like the efficacy of masks during the COVID panic and the efficacy of the so-called vaccine during the COVID panic. This was happening. This is the power of the state suppressing speech and effectively censoring the public's dialogue in the digital public square, which is really where ideas are argued now. And it's an incredibly dangerous situation. So not only is the press not a check on power, it has in fact become a tool, and a very effective tool, of the administrative state's power.
So COVID, in many ways, is the Great Awakening. Because people now had their eyes opened because they were able to see firsthand, and they saw their kids sitting at home, and they saw what they're being taught, and they saw Zoom, and they said, wait, what are you teaching? And they said, all of a sudden go, wait, this is crazy. This is garbage. Same thing with all this stuff, the masks and the social distancing circles. You can't even believe it. What the hell is wrong with these people? And you think about it, we lived through that. That actually happened. That wasn't some sort of dystopian book. That was real. That happened, and it was bureaucrats who decided it. And let's be clear, too many elected officials, just blind sheep, went right along with it.
We are not dealing with our parents' or grandparents' Democrat Party. These are not liberals who love America and just disagree with conservatives on the best way to get there. These are leftist. These are Marxist. They do not believe in free speech. They believe in censorship. They do not believe in equality. They believe in equity. They do not believe in due process and equal protection under the law. They believe in a politicized and weaponized justice system to go after their political enemies, whether it's Trump, his top aides, his supporters on January 6th, parents outraged by gender chaos in schools and the resulting rapes in high school bathrooms, Christians praying in abortion clinics while they give amnesty to BLM and Antifa and Hamas and Planned Parenthood activist and trans terrorist. We need to wake up and understand we're dealing with Marxism. We're dealing with an evil force that hates America, and they're trying to do whatever they can to destroy us from within.
I want to thank Elon Musk and anybody that's working there for just pointing out the stupidity of all this, right? And giving the public information. It's going to be transparency and accountability. That's what you should expect out of your government. So I think what's going to happen is people are going to expect more information, which is they should. It's your government. And then Congress's role is we need to do real oversight.
They get up and they talk about in very succinct fashion what they plan to do with Doge. And they went through and they're talking about crowdsourcing and AI and things they can do and exposing a lot of the waste, fraud, abuse, and all the things that we can try to fix. Best thing you can do is expose this to hold this room accountable, because you've been searching for the enemy, and the enemy is right in front of you. It is us. It is Congress. We're the ones that continue to fund the very things that we sit here at the mic begging you in an informal entity. We're begging you to save us because we're that bad.
Our job is to pass the laws, not some unelected bureaucrat.
right? But I'll give you an example. So first off, you know how many unessential workers I had in my business life? 0. I would not have unessential. No customer of mine wanted to pay for non-essential workers, right? So let's take the Federal Reserve. How many people do you think work there? 23,000. 23,000. 23. What do they do? Oh, one thing, they review some of the banks, like Silicon Valley Bank. All right, Silicon Valley Bank went bankrupt. You know how many people got fired for that? None. All right. Remember the financial crisis of 2008? Okay. Federal Reserve is responsible part of that, right? You know how many people got fired? None. I mean, I don't know until Trump came in. I don't know anybody that's gotten fired. No one, there's no accountability. So, and who wants to fire people? I don't want to fire anybody. But golly, if you don't do your job, you shouldn't have the job.
I am so thrilled that people spoke up on November 5th, that they showed up at the polls and that they made their opinion known. They spoke out. They are tired of 2 tiers of justice. They're tired of 2 tiers of treatment, 2 tiers of access. They have witnessed how the Democrats have built this fiefdom, if you will, that benefits their friends. And people are tired of that. They are tired of seeing our veterans not get benefits that they have earned while money is being spent to pay for health care for people that are in the country illegally. The VA backlog, when Joe Biden walked out of that office, 954,000 cases. Why is that? Because people that worked in VA benefits worked 2 days out of a 10-day work period in person, and healthcare worked 5 days in person out of a 10-day.
President Trump, I think, is respected grudgingly in some cases, but respected for actually doing in his first weeks in office exactly what he promised he would do on the campaign trail. So one of the ways in which, I think you make elections matter again is to be serious about governing. And President Trump in his second term has proved he's very serious about governing. He's thought about the problems of governance. He's much more, I think, polished and has a much, more coherent team around him now than he did in his first term. But it's President Trump himself who gets this. I mean, he got it a long time ago. It's just now, I think, in his second term that he's really coming into his own and with the right people around him to make a change. And that in itself might have a way of reinvigorating our constitutional republic.
Step one is we have to actually shrink government and and we have to make some dramatic steps to do it. Like, we're not going to tame the Leviathan about which you speak if we accept that we've got Leviathan in all of these roles and we just need to make it more efficient. So with all due respect to DOJ, it shouldn't be the Department of Government Efficiency, it should be the Department of Government Elimination. And we should be slashing and burning and getting rid of stuff. And then if you get it down to the basics of what the Constitution contemplates that this federal government is supposed to do, then under balance of powers, use Congress to be the check and empower Congress. And Article 1 take its power to make sure we're checking the executive from going down the road of the administrative state. I think to get there will take courage by the president this time and Congress to slash and burn.
Is there any real oversight? Well, there are oversight hearings. There's lots of talk, a lot of letters that are written to agency heads and to the administration. I contend to you that the real oversight is money.
Yes.
You have to defund agencies that abuse their power. You have to defund bureaucrats who abuse their power and take money away from them. That's the true oversight.
One of the ways we can reduce this massive and crushing regulatory burden is by moving these agencies and these departments out of Washington, D.C., and I mean that far away from Washington, D.C. In some cases, the further the better. And why? Because what you'll see immediately is a lot of people self-selecting to not continue to work there. You'll see a lot of bureaucrats. This happens anytime a private company moves. It would certainly happen with the federal government. People, there would be an immediate attrition just by doing that. But I think secondly, you can also change the culture of these institutions. One of the reasons that these agencies and these bureaucracies, one of the reasons that they're so polluted is that they all fester in the culture of Washington, D.C. And this place really is a swamp. I think swamp is actually too kind because there are beautiful things in swamps. It's more of a sewer, all right? It's a Washington sewer. And getting them out of this milieu, physically out of here, would be very, very significant. And then the second tangible act, which I hope will happen, whether it's directly from President Trump or the Doge doing this, is to fire massive amounts of employees. Fire massive amounts of federal employees. Number one, to prove you have the power to do so. But number two, to start to defang this Leviathan, this regulatory monster that we've allowed to build up in this country for a century.
You have to starve the beast. And the beast is the federal government. And so many of the states, right? Because I think the check against the power of the federal government was always our 50 states, right? It was the federalist system. But so many of the states now are just attached to the government largesse in so many different ways that it makes that it's rendered their ability to push back moot or even neutered to a very great extent. So I think a radical federalism that gives, where the federal government does have the connection to the states, gives them the ability to control that money on their own if they take it at all. Right? I think that's a very big check. But also I think the system itself here needs to be assessed and dismantled. I mean, we're not talking about cutting around the edges. We're not talking about marginal defunding at the discretionary appropriations level. We are talking about systemic dismantling of some of these power centers that do not serve the United States. When is the last time any of these agencies were audited for effectiveness? And I'm not talking about like where the money goes, because that is a good question, but I'm talking about how many people work there? What do they do every day? What do these regulations serve? Are they actually effective? We all make fun of the consulting companies and the McKinseys of the world, but like, have we done an efficiency audit of these companies or of these agencies? No, because if we did, it would show that they are just there's a giant sucking sound from the United States Treasury, and it's going into these agencies that produce nothing.
I think one of the great questions of the present moment is whether or not Congress is going to live up to its constitutional responsibilities of being a legislative body. But Congress has frankly shirked its responsibilities for a very, very long time now. Members of Congress, at least since the middle part of the 20th century, have been more comfortable with their role, I think, as ombudsmen as opposed to legislators or forming governing coalitions. By ombudsmen, I mean they act as go-betweens between their constituents and the administrative state, which Congress itself has created through delegation, and they get all their political perks, and their reelection, incentives are linked to serving constituent needs and saying, aha, I will help solve the problem that Washington is creating for you. But having people forget that Congress is ultimately responsible for creating that problem to begin with by delegating vast amounts of power to the administrative state.
The long-term result is going to require the federal judiciary stepping in. And I would always say this, the political branches are not going to drain the swamp. Why the hell would the reptiles drain the swamp? It's going to have to come from the federal judiciary. I call these federal judges the plumbers. And it's going to take 20 years. President Trump started it in his first term with the appointments of Justice Gorsuch, my former boss, Justice Kavanaugh, and we're starting to see the results. We're starting to stop giving deference to these federal agencies through Chevron deference and our deference. We're going to stop telling these federal agencies that we're going to defer to their interpretation of the law. That is a judge's job to interpret the law, not unelected bureaucrats in the executive branch. And then we're going to start telling these executive branch agencies, not only do you not have judicial power, you don't get to interpret your own laws. We're not going to defer to that. You also don't have the power to write your own laws. That's Congress's job. And so when that happens, you're going to see these federal agencies get neutered, and then the 20-year project is to take power away from the federal government and return it to the states and we the people as the Constitution requires.
The first mechanism, via a new statute that would be a great improver of accountability is something called the REINS Act. And the REINS Act would basically provide that if there's a rule that puts out, that puts a wet blanket over the American economy of more than $100 million, then in order for that to actually go into legal effect, Congress would have to have an up or down vote to agree to it. we would want the REINS Act they could put out a regulation, but if Congress doesn't agree that it's proper, then it dies and it does not become law. The second mechanism is that he wants to bring back the presidential power of impoundment. The impoundment power is a power that recognizes that floors and ceilings are two different things. So the executive branch, which are essentially the agents of those who are passing the laws, right, in this respect, that they're the stewards of the money, and so they can't spend more than they've been given to spend. And the Constitution says no dollars can be spent, out of the Treasury without Congress's authorization and approval. And so, so that means that you can't spend more. That establishes a ceiling, but it doesn't establish a floor. And for all of our history up until the Nixon administration, if a president got, a set of instructions, a program to administer, and he could do it for cheaper than what Congress had set aside as the funds to be available to accomplish those purposes, then of course he did it. And so we need to have this system back, because what has happened under interest group politics, under pluralism, under the rise of the administrative state, is that Congress, working with these interest groups, will not just try to set a ceiling so that there's fiscal accountability that they have to then report to their constituents about, but they're going to set the floor. They're going to tell you that we're going to tell you what money we're going to put in this program, and you have to spend every last dollar. And if you don't, you have to report to us, and we can go to court, and we can have this character called the comptroller of the United States, bring the president of the United States into court to sue him to try to block these impoundments. That entire system is unconstitutional. And I think in the new administration, those at the Justice Department, those at OMB, the president, I think they're going to reassert this power hard, and I think that's eventually going to get a case to the Supreme Court. And I would predict we're going to see a resurrection of this impoundment power.
To reboot all of it. The entire government ought to be zero-based budgeted up from the bottom up, and we ought to go through every bit of it in a discretionary budget like every house. We should end all of this mandatory garbage. We should end the power of bureaucrats. We should fire probably half or more of all bureaucrats.
The Doge is going to have trouble in a matter of just months, or even say just one presidential term, reversing the century of damage that the administrative state has wrought upon our country. That is, I think, being realistic and accurate. But at the same time, changing the thinking, shifting the paradigm in the United States is incredibly important. And to me, if I had to project, that's going to be the biggest contribution of Doge and of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and President Trump, is shifting the paradigm.
The game changer is Donald Trump. I mean, drain the swamp, come to Washington to do something about it. And in this case, nominating disruptors in all of these agencies. We've never seen anything like this before. I mean, Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon to disrupt the Pentagon. I mean, that's the whole point of it. All of Kash Patel at FBI to disrupt the FBI, to take on the Department of Justice. I mean, that's what the Trump administration is all about, and why he learned these tough lessons the first time that he dare not repeat the next time.
We're in a situation now where you have this epidemic of distrust, right? Americans do not trust their government. And it is not because of some conspiracy theory. It's not because of misinformation. It is because the institutions themselves have become fundamentally untrustworthy. And if, the last 8 years have been the perfect example of this. The way in which the administrative state mounted a coup against Donald Trump, used the levers of supposedly neutral institutions to do it. And those institutions belong to all of us. They don't belong to the left. And so I think the only way you start to claw that trust back, to bring these agencies, these pillars of government that you actually need to restore rule of law and make a functional society. This is where the social contract meets, right? To bring that back to neutral, to stasis, I think you have to open the books on all these things. You have to have this radical transparency that brings everything out into the light. And it allows the American people to see everything that's gone on in the last 20, 30, 50, 60 years. And so we can say, okay, we can have a national reckoning with what's been done in our name. Because that's what really gets me about this, is when people say, oh no, there's some things the American people can't know. There's some secrets the government has to keep. This isn't a them and us. This has been done in our name. And it is our right as citizens to see what's been done.
Americans have a decision to make. Are we going to be serfs to a feudal administrative state, or are we going to throw them off and be freeborn Americans again and recapture our rights, our God-given rights that are enshrined in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights that our founders understood was the absolute purpose of government?
I do believe that the American people have finally reached a breaking point. And I think President Trump's election is a huge step toward that process of reclaiming this republic. If I'm right that this is the patriotic populist moment, then the time to strike is now. The time to drive a stake into the heart of the administrative state, of that Leviathan, that monster. It's right now.
The American people must understand that they have an important role to play in the ending of the administrative state. As Phil Hamburger wrote, ultimately the defeat of administrative power will have to come from the people. Only their spirit of liberty can move Congress, inspire the president, and brace the judges to do their duty. Americans need to recognize that administrative power revives absolute power and profoundly threatens civil liberties. Once Americans understand this, they can begin to push back, and the fate of administrative power will then only be a matter of time.
40 years ago, Ronald Reagan said that no country who had ever gone down this far the path of bureaucratic statism had ever been able to come back. Once you were down, you were gone. But I think we can come back. We were the first country in the world with a constitutional republic. We were the first country to put a man on the moon. Every day, this country does something that no one has ever seen before in the history of the world. If there is anyone who can shake off the shackles of bureaucratic statism, it's us. It's America.
Woodrow Wilson once wrote that we are not bound to adhere to the doctrines held by the signers of the Declaration of Independence. We are as free as they were to make or unmake governments. We should have that same mentality. We are not bound to adhere to the doctrines of the progressives. We are not bound to adhere to their administrative state. We are as free as they were to unmake governments, and so it should be our goal to unmake the administrative state. We must understand that the foundation of the swamp here in DC is the administrative state. And so the solution before us is simple, although monumental in application. Break the state, drain the swamp, restore the republic.